We changed the locks. Go to a hotel, my son yelled from the second floor window, laughing with a coldness that froze the blood in my veins. I'm Lucille. I'm 71 years old, and I spent the last 3 decades taking care of every corner of that house and the family that was now shutting the door in my face. What Mark didn't know while he mocked me behind the glass was that the true control of that property was never in the piece of metal he had just changed out of pure ignorance. Just hours before my world split in two, the morning had started with the exact same silent routine of the last 5 years. I got up at 5:30 a.m. when the sky was still a dark, purple bruise over the neighborhood rooftops. The house was submerged in absolute silence, that heavy, pre-dawn quiet that only the old and the sleepless truly know. I walked barefoot down the hallway so the hardwood floors wouldn't creak, feeling the chill of the wood creeping up my ankles. My knees, worn down by the years and the dampness, protested with a dull pop, but I ignored them. A mother's love, or at least love as I understood it, doesn't stop for aching joints. Love is what you do in the dark, while everyone else is resting, so that when they open their eyes, they find the world a little softer, a little easier to navigate. I reached the kitchen and flipped on the small light hanging over the sink. I pulled out the old coffee maker, the one Mark had told me 1,000 times to throw away because it clashed with the modern decor his wife Rachel was trying to force on the house. But that machine made the best, strongest coffee exactly how they liked it to wake up. I measured the dark grounds with precision, poured the purified water, and hit the switch. As that bitter, comforting aroma started filling the room, I pulled out a ceramic bowl to prep the dough for the beef turnovers. Mark always said Tuesdays at the car dealership where he worked were only bearable if he took my homemade turnovers for lunch. My hands, dotted with brown age spots and knuckles swollen from arthritis, moved with the mechanical memory of decades of labor. I mixed the flour, the shortening, and the warm water. I kneaded hard, putting the full weight of my shoulders into the counter. In every motion, there was a quiet devotion. It was my way of telling them they mattered, that I was there to hold them up. I packed the lunch boxes, cut the crusts off the sandwich bread for my grandson Nick, and ironed his little school uniform that had been left wrinkled in the hamper the night before. I did all of this without letting out a single sigh of complaint. By 7 a.m., when I heard Rachel's first footsteps coming down the stairs, breakfast was served, steaming and perfect on the dining room table. Nobody said thank you that morning. Rachel grabbed her coffee mug without looking me in the eye, her thumb endlessly scrolling across her phone screen. Mark rushed downstairs, snatched the lunchbox I held out to him, and gave me a distracted kiss on the cheek, a cold brush of skin I barely felt. Nick, half asleep, was the only one who smiled at me, his mouth smeared with jelly, before his mother yanked him by the hand to drag him to the car. I stood there on the porch, wiping my hands on my apron, watching them drive off down the street until the car vanished around the corner. The house was left empty, feeding me back the echo of my own footsteps. To me, that house wasn't just a building of brick and cement. It was the grand project of my life. Anthony, my late husband, and I bought it 40 years ago, back when it was nothing more than a half-finished frame in a neighborhood just starting to get its roads paved. Anthony spent every weekend of his adult life painting walls, fixing pipes, installing windows, and planting the front yard. I sewed the original curtains, picked out every bathroom tile, and polished the hardwood floors until my knees bled. When Anthony died 15 years ago from a massive heart attack while pruning the rosebush he loved so much, I felt like my world was ending. He left me with a massive void, a modest widow's pension, and this house. To survive the grief, I clung to the walls, the garden, and our only son, Mark. 5 years ago, Mark lost his corporate job in the city and his rented apartment. He showed up at my door one rainy night with a pregnant Rachel, a pile of suitcases, and the shattered look of a defeated man. "Mom, it'll just be for a few months until I get back on my feet," he told me at the door. I didn't hesitate for a second. I opened my arms and the doors of my home. I gave him the master bedroom, the one I had shared with Anthony, with its private bath and the big bay window. I moved into the sewing room at the back of the house, a cramped, dark space near the kitchen where a twin bed and a wardrobe barely fit. The months turned into years. Mark found work, but their savings never seemed to be enough for them to move out. Rachel started complaining about the dust, my antique furniture, the way I cooked. Little by little, I kept shrinking myself down in my own home so I wouldn't be a bother, turning into an invisible presence, a silent maid who paid with her labor and her pension for the right to not be alone. A mother makes herself small so her children can grow big. That was the lie I repeated to myself every night in front of the mirror. At 9 a.m. that Tuesday, I grabbed my plaid canvas shopping cart and headed out to the municipal market. The sun was already high, and the heat was starting to bounce off the asphalt. I walked the 8 blocks that separated me from the grocery stalls. Every step was an effort. My right knee fired off sharp shots of pain, and my breath grew short, but the mental grocery list kept pushing me forward. I had to buy premium extra lean ground beef because Rachel got disgusted if she chewed on any gristle. I had to find the reddest, firmest tomatoes for the lunch sauce, and I wanted to swing by the bakery to buy Nick some butter cookies, his absolute favorite, with the little cash I had left from my bi-weekly check. The market was loud, smelling of ripe fruit and fresh fish. I greeted the butcher, a kind man who always saved the best cuts for me. "Miss Lucille, up early and working hard as always," he said as he wrapped the meat in white butcher paper. "Got to feed the family," I replied, flashing a smile that took genuine effort to hold. I paid with crumpled bills I dug out of my cloth coin purse. At every stall, I left behind a little piece of my energy and my meager resources, all of it dedicated to making the people who slept under my roof happy. The walk back was even harder. The wheels of the cart squeaked and kept getting stuck in the cracks of the sidewalk. The weight of the bags pulled my shoulders down. The midday heat soaked my back in sweat. I had to stop twice in the shade of the oak trees to catch my breath, but I didn't care. As I walked, I was planning the meal, calculating cooking times, imagining my grandson's face when he saw the cookies. I reached my street just past 1 p.m. From the corner, I could see the reddish shingled roof and the big black iron gate guarding the driveway. I pushed the cart up the paved walkway. Anthony's rose bushes were thirsty under the unforgiving sun. I'll water them later, I thought, letting out a sigh of relief as I reached the porch. I climbed the 3 concrete steps with difficulty, lifting the cart by sheer force. I set it aside by the door and leaned against the siding for a second to rest my back. The neighborhood was dead silent, broken only by the distant chirp of a bird. I reached into my purse, a bottomless pit of grocery receipts, tissues, and blood pressure pills. Fumbling blindly, I searched for the heavy leather keychain Anthony had given me for our 10th anniversary. I found the old, thick, dull brass key, its edges worn smooth by decades of sliding in and out of that exact same lock. I held it between fingers, trembling from exhaustion, and brought it to the door. I slid the metal into the slot, or rather, I tried to. The key hit a metal wall just a fraction of an inch inside. I pushed a little harder, thinking maybe the humidity had swollen the wood of the door, which sometimes happened in the summer, but the key didn't give. I pulled it out, confused. I held it up to the sunlight to make sure I hadn't grabbed the wrong one off the ring. It was the right key. I tried again, wiggling it side to side carefully, looking for the angle, forcing the mechanism just a bit. Nothing. The metal scraped against a foreign interior, making a high-pitched scratching sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. I frowned in confusion. I wiped the sweat from my forehead with the back of my hand and slipped on the reading glasses hanging from the chain around my neck. I leaned in, bringing my face close to the sun-baked wood. The metal plate surrounding the keyhole wasn't the old, tarnished brass I knew by heart. The one with a tiny scratch on the left side from when Mark tried to pick it with a screwdriver as a teenager. It was a silver cylinder, polished, gleaming, and completely brand new. A different lock. For a brief second, my 71-year-old mind tried to cling to the most innocent logic. I thought maybe the old lock had broken that very morning, and Mark, in a rare act of kindness, had called an emergency locksmith before heading to work. Strange that he didn't call my cell to let me know, I muttered to myself. I raised my hand and knocked slowly on the wood with my knuckles. At first, "Mark, Rachel," I called out, bringing my mouth close to the crack of the door. "It's me, Lucille." The key seems to be jammed. Leaning out the large window of the master bedroom, the one I had given him, was Mark. He was wearing the light blue button-down shirt, The exact same shirt I had hand-washed the night before to get a grease stain out, scrubbing the fabric in the utility sink until my wrists ached. He was resting his elbows on the sill, looking down at me with an expression I couldn't quite place at first. There was no concern on his face. There was annoyance, and a shadow of a smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. "What's wrong, honey?" I asked, raising my voice so he could hear me from the yard. "I think the door's busted. My key won't go in. Come down and open it, please. I've got raw meat and the sun is brutal. We changed the locks." "Go to a hotel!" he yelled, and the echo of his voice bounced off the siding of the neighboring houses. I froze. The hot air stopped flowing into my lungs. The distant hum of traffic seemed to vanish completely, leaving only the sound of my own heart buzzing in my ears. My fingers went slack, and the leather keychain hit the concrete floor with a dry metallic clatter. "What are you talking about, Mark?" I managed to articulate, my voice shaking, feeling the ground beneath my feet lose its solidness. "Stop talking nonsense. Open the door. I have the groceries for the week. Nick's cookies are going to melt. Rachel and I have talked about this at length," he said. "We need our own space. We're sick of having no privacy, of not being able to invite friends over because your old junk takes up the whole house, of you always being in the way in the kitchen. We live here. We are raising our son here. You've run your course. You're coughing all day, dragging your feet, complaining about your aches and pains. It's depressing. We packed your things early this morning. They're in some black trash bags behind the big planter, right there on the porch. Behind the massive terracotta pot where I grew ferns, there were 3 heavy-duty black plastic bags tied shut with duct tape. 3 bags? 40 years of my life? Anthony's memories, my dresses, my shoes, my photographs, all packed up like garbage waiting for the sanitation truck to haul them away. Rachel's shadow appeared behind my son. She didn't even have the guts to show her face completely. I only saw her hand resting on Mark's shoulder, and I heard her muffled, irritated voice. "Tell her not to make a scene in the street. The neighbors across the way are already looking. Tell her to take her crap and go downtown. If you try to break the door or cause drama, I'm calling the cops and telling them you're disturbing the peace." Any other woman my age would have thrown herself to the ground, sobbing, clawing at the new wood of the door, begging for the love and compassion of the son she had carried in her womb. She would have screamed her dead husband's name, cursing the sky for the sheer injustice of it all. But not me. I went incredibly still. In that moment, under the blistering sun burning my shoulders, I felt something physical happen inside my chest. It wasn't a heart shattering into pieces. It was a door closing, a heavy, cold iron deadbolt sliding into place with a silent, final slam. For decades, I had been an endless well of patience, of forgiveness, of hot meals, clean clothes, and justifications. I had excused every dirty look from Rachel, every slight from Mark, every ounce of disrespect, convincing myself that they were young, that they were stressed, that a mother's love meant enduring. I had been the unconditional guardian of their well-being, ready to bleed my last drop for them, but the guardian had just been forcibly stripped of her post, and that massive, soft, maternal love that forgave everything evaporated from my body in a fraction of a second, drying up like a drop of water on a scorching iron. The affection was extinguished, leaving behind no fire, no uncontrolled rage, but a solid block of ice, an absolute clarity, sharp as a butcher's knife. The selfless mother died on that porch. In her place stood a cold, calculating sentinel who had just realized the enemy was sleeping inside her own castle. I didn't shed a single tear. I looked down at the grocery cart, the premium meat I had paid for with my hard work, the ripe tomatoes, the sweet cookies for the grandson they wouldn't let me see, things bought with love for people who considered me garbage. I bent down slowly, picked up my keychain from the ground, and slipped it into my skirt pocket. Then I walked with a slow, steady pace down the paved walkway until I reached the center of the front yard. There, under the protective shade of the oldest rose bush, sat the wooden bench Anthony had built with his own 2 hands. I sat down carefully, feeling the relief wash over my battered knees. I placed my heavy purse on my lap and settled my back against the rustic wood. I looked at the house, the brick facade, the gleaming windows, the manicured lawn. Mark and Rachel were in there, probably laughing, hugging, congratulating themselves for having the nerve to kick out the annoying old lady and seize the house. They believe that because they went to the hardware store, bought a new lock, and screwed it into the front door, the power was theirs. They thought they had left me on the street, defenseless, forced to wander the city begging for charity, or crawling on my knees pleading for them to let me sleep in the hallway. I adjusted my glasses on the bridge of my nose. I reached into my purse, bypassing the keys that were now utterly useless, the tissues, and the medicine. My fingers found the cold plastic of my cell phone, an old device with big buttons and a tiny screen that Mark always made fun of, saying I didn't have the mental capacity to understand modern technology. I pulled it out and held it in the palm of my hand. What my son, in his infinite arrogance, his massive ignorance, and his blind cruelty had completely forgotten was a small, practical detail about how the adult world actually works. A structural, everyday detail that required no lawyers, no notary signatures, no screaming matches on the sidewalk. A miscalculation so monumental that it was about to bring his little fantasy of power crashing down in a matter of minutes. I dialed from memory, slowly and precisely, the numbers for the electric company's customer service line. I brought the phone to my ear, listening to the dial tone while staring dead ahead at the closed second-floor window. They wanted their space. They wanted absolute independence. They had slammed the door in my face, convinced that they now ruled the kingdom. They didn't have the slightest clue that the person they had just thrown out on the street was the only one holding up the invisible foundation that made that kingdom function. And I was about to turn their world off. The plastic of the phone burned under the midday sun, but my fingers, used to holding hot pots and steaming irons, didn't tremble as I pressed the keys. The glare on the screen barely let me see the numbers, but it didn't matter. I knew the sequence by heart. It was the exact same number I had called every month, religiously, for 30 years, to make sure my family never had to eat dinner in the dark or freeze in the winter. The difference was that today, that same methodical devotion was going to serve a completely opposite purpose. I held the device to my ear. The dull ring sounded 3 times before a metallic, pre-recorded voice flooded the line. Thank you for calling Southern Energy and Utilities. For balance inquiries, press 1. To report an outage, press 2. For account ownership and service disconnection, press 3. I pressed 3 with the pad of my thumb, applying a sharp force. The silence in the yard was absolute. From my spot on the wooden bench, under the protective shade of Anthony's rosebush, I had a perfect view of the front of the house. The second-floor windows were shut tight. I knew exactly what was happening in there. Rachel, my daughter-in-law, was probably adjusting the central AC thermostat to fight off the blistering afternoon heat, while Mark, my son, was surely pouring himself a glass of ice-cold water from the fridge dispenser I had cleaned myself just last night with baking soda and vinegar. They thought they were the king and queen of the castle because they swapped a brass lock for a silver cylinder. Southern Energy and Utilities. Gabrielle speaking. Who do I have the pleasure of speaking with? The voice on the other end was young, professional, and devoid of any emotion. A perfect contrast to the silent hurricane raging in my chest. Good afternoon, Gabrielle. This is Lucille Villalobos, I replied. My voice sounded firm, without the slightest trace of the tears that any 71-year-old woman would have shed after being tossed out onto the street like a bag of trash. I'm calling to request the immediate and permanent suspension of electrical service at my residence. There was a brief pause, the sound of a keyboard clacking rapidly. I understand, Mrs. Villalobos. To proceed with any structural modification to the account, I need to verify your identity. Could you provide your customer number, please? You can find it in the top right corner of your bill. I didn't need to dig for any bill in the abyss of my purse. I closed my eyes for a second and pictured the yellow paper that arrived every month. 802, correct? Gabrielle murmured. Social Security number. I gave it to her without hesitating. Date of birth. I gave her that too. Exact amount of your last payment, made 10 days ago. You are the sole registered account holder for this service, the operator confirmed. I must inform you that by requesting a permanent disconnection of the meter, any future reactivation will require a new contract, the payment of a connection fee, and the presentation of updated property deeds. Are you aware of this? I see in the system that your residence has one of the new smart digital meters installed last year. This means we don't need to send a technical crew out to physically cut the wires. The power will be shut off remotely from our headquarters. The process will take a maximum of 10 to 15 minutes to take effect. Perfect. Execute the order, please. And thank you for your efficiency, Gabrielle. I hung up the phone. The final click echoed in my head like a hammer driving in a nail. I sat still, breathing in the thick summer air, feeling the sweat bead on the back of my neck. I looked at the house again, and as I waited for time to pass, a sharp, heavy, dark memory rose from the depths of my mind, superimposing itself over the brick facade in front of me. It happened 15 years ago, on a November night when the rain was lashing against the glass with unusual fury. Anthony was still alive. Mark was barely 25 and had just totaled a sports car he had bought on credit, convinced that his salary as an administrative assistant would let him live the life of a CEO. That night, Mark had walked into our kitchen soaking wet, crying crocodile tears, begging us to save him from the debt collectors who were threatening to repossess everything down to his clothes. Anthony, with that endless patience that always defined him, pulled out his retirement savings and paid off our son's debt. Mark went to sleep in his old bedroom, relieved, without offering a single sincere thank you. But when the house fell quiet, Anthony didn't come back to bed. I found him sitting at the kitchen table under the dim light of the hanging fixture. His hands were resting on a brown cardboard folder. They were a working man's hands, heavily calloused, permanently stained with paint and motor grease, hands that had raised every wall of this house. I sat across from him. Anthony pushed the folder toward me. Inside were the property deeds, the water, electric, and gas contracts, the property tax records. "Lucille, listen to me very carefully," he told me that night, and his voice sounded older, far more tired than a man his age should sound. "I went to the notary this morning. I put everything, absolutely everything, exclusively in your name. The accounts, the utilities, the house, everything." "But Anthony, we're both the owners," I protested, not understanding the urgency in his dark eyes. "No, Lucille, you are going to be the sole owner. Promise me." Anthony took my hands, squeezing them with a force that scared me. "Our son Mark has a hole in his pocket, and an even bigger one in his character. He thinks the world owes him everything just for breathing. He doesn't know how to build, Lucille. He only knows how to consume. If I'm gone someday, and you give him even a fraction of control, he'll sell the chair right out from under you. He'll leave you on the street without looking back. Promise me you will never let go of these papers. Promise me the control of this house dies with you." Crying, frightened by his prophetic tone, I promised him. Anthony died of a massive heart attack barely 6 months after that conversation. And for 15 years, I kept that promise in silence. When Mark and Rachel moved in temporarily 5 years ago, I never mentioned to them that the house wasn't in my name and my late husband's name, but solely and exclusively in mine. They assumed what most arrogant children assume, that old mothers are just a formality, a temporary obstacle before the inevitable inheritance. Incompetent beings who don't understand paperwork or bureaucracy. A sudden noise yanked me back to the present. It was a deep, dull, mechanical groan. The motor of the central AC condenser unit installed on the side of the house, which had been humming for hours to keep my executioners cool, coughed, sputtered, and died completely. The metal fan blades slowed down until they stopped with an agonizing screech. Immediately after, silence fell over the property. I looked at the living room window. The little green light of the internet router, always visibly blinking through the glass, had vanished. The daylight darkness had claimed the inside. The power grid had done its job. Mark and Rachel's world had just ground to a halt. I looked down at my feet. My plaid canvas cart was still there, full. The premium ground beef was starting to sweat through the butcher's white paper. The tomatoes were warm to the touch. I wasn't about to let the food I bought with my meager pension rot in the sun. I stood up, feeling a pop in my right knee, but the pain felt distant, irrelevant. I grabbed the handle of the cart and started walking, not toward the street, but toward the left property line, where a short hedge divided my yard from the neighbor's house, Agnes's house. Agnes was 75, the widow of a military man, and had lived on that plot since before the street was paved. We had swapped recipes over that fence for 4 decades. When I reached the bushes, I didn't even have to call out to her. Agnes was already there. She was standing on her back porch, holding a garden hose she was using to pretend to water some begonias, but her dark, knife-sharp eyes were locked on me. She wore her immaculate apron, her white hair pulled back into a strict bun. I saw everything, Lucille, Agnes said, shutting off the hose valve. Her voice held no pity, no mercy. It carried military indignation. I saw when your idiot son yelled at you from the window. I saw the trash bags. I was about to call the cops myself for elder abuse. No need for the police, Agnes, I replied, pushing my cart through the little wooden gate that connected our yards. Do you have room in your fridge? I bought meat and I don't want it to spoil. It cost me a lot. Agnes asked no useless questions. Come in. I just cleaned out the freezer this morning. There's plenty of space. We went into her kitchen. It was a cool haven that smelled of lavender and polished wood. The grandfather clock on the wall ticked the steady rhythm of a house in order. We opened the packages. Agnes arranged the meat in her freezer, put the tomatoes in the crisper drawer, and set the butter cookies for my grandson Nick on the granite counter. As we worked in silence, Agnes made a pitcher of iced tea with lemon. She poured 2 tall glasses full of ice cubes that clinked against the glass. Sit right here, she ordered, pointing to a chair by her kitchen window that offered a perfect, diagonal view of the side of my house, exactly where the breaker box was installed. Drink, your lips are dry. I took a long sip. The cold liquid slid down my throat, clearing my thoughts even more. The power was just cut at my house, Agnes, and it's not coming back, I said, staring straight through the lace curtains of her window. Agnes froze with the pitcher in her hand. A slow smile, loaded with a wicked, solidary understanding, spread across her wrinkled face. Ah, I see how we're playing this. She sat across from me, resting her elbows on the table. They're going to boil alive in there. It's the worst heat wave of the year. We didn't have to wait long. Barely 5 minutes later, the side door of my house yanked open violently. Mark stepped outside. Agnes and I watched him from the cool shadows of the neighbor's kitchen. Mark was wearing the same light blue shirt I had washed for him, but now it had massive dark sweat stains under the arms and down the center of his back. His face, previously pale and mocking, was flushed red with heat and frustration. He walked with heavy steps, clutching his cell phone in one hand. He marched straight to the gray breaker box embedded in the brick wall. He flipped the metal cover open impatiently. He started slamming the switches, flipping them up and down hard, cursing loudly. "Damn it!" he yelled, punching the box with a closed fist. "The whole block has power except us." Mark walked toward the fence, trampling the flower beds I had weeded myself just last Sunday. "Mom!" he yelled from his side of the property line, poking his head over the hedges. "What the hell did you do? Why are you hiding in Mrs. Agnes's house?" I stood up slowly, taking my glass of iced tea, and walked toward Agnes's back door. I stepped out onto the covered porch, keeping a safe distance, but close enough so he could hear me with absolute clarity. "I'm drinking a glass of tea, Mark. It's very hot out," I replied. My voice was flat, stripped of any maternal warmth. It was the voice of a stranger. Mark gripped the branches of the hedge, snapping a few leaves in his nervous agitation. The power went out. The fridge is off. The AC isn't working. And Rachel is hysterical because there's no internet and she can't upload her photos. "Did you touch something on the meter before you left? You're always ruining things, Mom. You're a damn nuisance. Tell me what you touched so I can fix it fast." That word, nuisance. He had used it so many times in recent years, always in whispers when he thought I wasn't listening, or in arguments with his wife. A nuisance who cooked, a nuisance who washed clothes, a nuisance who paid the property taxes. I took a sip of tea. The ice made a sharp, crystalline clink. "I didn't touch the meter, Mark," I said, looking him dead in the eyes. "I simply called the electric company and canceled my contract. Since you told me I don't live there anymore, that I've run my course, and that it's your house now, it felt wrong to keep paying for a service I'm not going to use. I'm an older woman. I have to stretch my pension." It took a few seconds for the realization to penetrate my son's thick skull. He blinked, stunned, letting go of the branches. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a strangled sound came out. When he finally managed to articulate words, his tone tried to claw its way back to the arrogance of the morning, but it was tainted with undeniable panic. "You're crazy," he spat, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You're completely out of your mind if you think this childish tantrum is going to get you the house back. You're a bitter old woman. It doesn't matter. I don't need your handouts. I'll call the company myself right now and have them reconnect the service. I have the money to pay for it, and when they do, I'm going to report you for sabotage." "Go right ahead," I replied, my tone entirely unchanged. "Call them." Mark took a step back. He held up his latest generation smartphone, the one he paid massive monthly installments for, and dialed the number furiously. He put it on speaker at maximum volume so I could hear his victory. The ringing echoed in the hot garden air. Agnes peeked out from behind me, arms crossed, enjoying the show with a stone-cold smile. The same metallic voice answered. Then the system transferred him to a human operator. This time it was a young man. Southern Energy and Utilities. "Charles speaking. How can I help you?" "I'm Mark Villalobos, the owner of the property located at 42 Willow Street. Someone just cut my power by mistake, and I need it reactivated immediately. It's an emergency. I have a small child in the house." "Allow me to check the system, Mr. Villalobos," the operator replied. We listened to the clacking of keys for 10 agonizing seconds. Mark looked at me with a triumphant smirk, nodding his head, convinced that his masculine authority would be enough to undo my supposed tantrum. "Mr. Villalobos, I have the account in front of me," Charles said through the speaker. The service was not disconnected by mistake. The exclusive account holder, Mrs. Lucille Villalobos, requested the permanent cancellation of the contract a few minutes ago. Yeah, I know," Mark interrupted, losing his patience and raising his voice. "My mother is an elderly woman who doesn't know what she's doing. She had an episode of mental confusion. I am her son, and I live in that house. I order you to reverse that cancellation right now and turn the power back on." There was an icy silence on the other end of the line. When Charles spoke again, his professional tone had hardened into institutional steel. "I am very sorry, sir, but that is absolutely impossible. You are not listed as the account holder, co-holder, or authorized contact on this account. Due to strict security and privacy policies, you cannot authorize any action on a contract that doesn't belong to you." "But I live there! That is my house!" Mark screamed, his face blood red, completely losing his composure. "If you reside at that address and wish to have electrical service, you will need to request a new contract in your name," the operator explained with the relentless monotony of bureaucracy. "To do so, you must appear in person at our central office. You must bring your ID and, strictly required, the original property deed in your name, or failing that, a notarized lease agreement signed by the legal owner. Once the documents are submitted, the new connection process takes between 48 and 72 business hours." The phone nearly slipped out of Mark's sweaty hands. The silence that overtook my son was absolute, heavy, devastating. Reality had just hit him in the face with the force of a freight train. He didn't have the deed. He didn't have a lease. He had absolutely nothing to his name that legally tied him to the ground he was standing on. He was a legal ghost, living in someone else's house. He had changed the physical lock on a wooden door, blinded by his own ignorance, forgetting that in the adult world, true control isn't held with keys, but with deeds, signatures, and titles. "But I don't have—" "My mother has the papers," Mark stammered, and for the first time in 30 years, I heard true terror in his voice. His gaze slowly rose from the phone and locked onto me. There was no more mockery, no more contempt. There was only the look of a terrified little boy who just realized he broke something he doesn't know how to fix. "Would you like me to schedule an appointment at the branch for you to present the documentation, sir?" Charles asked, oblivious to the human drama unfolding in the yard. Mark ended the call. His hand dropped lifelessly to his side. Sweat dripped down his temples. He looked back at the dead house behind him. Then he looked at me. "Mom," he whispered. His voice was shaking. The afternoon heat seemed to crush him into the dry grass. "What have you done?" Agnes followed me back inside, shutting the screen door behind us. I sat back down at the table and picked up my cell phone resting next to the glass of iced tea. "Agnes," I said, never taking my eyes off the bright little screen, "would you do me a favor and hand me your local phone book? The one you keep by the microwave." My neighbor walked over to the shelf, grabbed the thick yellow pages, and dropped it onto the table with a heavy thud. "Who are you going to call now, Lucille?" she asked, her eyes shining with pure anticipation. I unlocked my phone and started dialing a new sequence of numbers. The water and sewer utility company, I answered, pressing the phone to my ear and listening to the first ring. They also have a remote shut-off system, and if I recall correctly, Rachel hates not being able to shower when it's hot. Northern Water Utilities. My name is Lauren. Who am I speaking with? The sound anchored me to the present, pushing away for a moment the image of my paralyzed son baking under the midday sun. I settled into the wooden chair in Agnes's kitchen, rested my elbows on the sunflower print oilcloth, and took a deep breath. The cool air inside contrasted violently with the firestorm brewing next door, where the silence of dead motors signaled the beginning of the end. Good afternoon, Lauren. This is Lucille Villalobos, I replied, maintaining the same steady, emotionless tone I had used minutes earlier. I need to request the immediate and permanent suspension of water service at my residence. There was a pause on the other end, followed by the rapid clicking of a keyboard. Unlike electricity, water has always been a more grounded, physical utility. It doesn't travel through the air, and you can't cut it by pushing a button on a distant screen. Water runs through pipes buried in the mud, through veins of copper and plastic that my late husband had helped install with his own 2 hands. I understand, Mrs. Villalobos, the operator said, regaining her professional tone. To process a permanent disconnection, we must first verify your identity as the exclusive account holder. Please provide your account number, your social security number, and the exact date of the last payment registered in our system. I rattled off the numbers from memory, with the precision of someone who has managed scarcity for decades. Every digit was a reminder of the silent sacrifices I had made to keep that home afloat. The times I had walked in the pouring rain to pay the bill before the due date. The times I had mended the same gray skirt so the money would stretch far enough for the summer rates. Lauren confirmed the data with a murmur of approval. Everything is in order, Mrs. Villalobos. The system shows you have a flawless payment history spanning more than 35 years, the operator noted, a hint of genuine respect in her voice. However, I must inform you that our protocol for shutting off the municipal water supply is different from other utilities. We don't have remote shut-off valves in your area. To stop the flow, we need to dispatch a technician from our crew to manually shut the main valve at the curb and install a security seal along with a cast iron padlock. Do you consent to this procedure? Furthermore, I must warn you that any attempt to force, break, or tamper with the company's padlock by third parties constitutes a federal offense for tampering with public infrastructure, subject to severe fines and potential criminal prosecution. If someone needs to reactivate the service, they must present themselves at our offices with the original property deed in their name to apply for a new meter. Do you understand the implications, ma'am? I understand perfectly. Send the work order immediately, please. I will dispatch the order right away. They will be there in approximately 20 minutes. I thanked the operator and hung up. I set the phone on the table next to the glass of iced tea Agnes had poured for me. My neighbor was watching me from across the granite counter, arms crossed, wearing an expression that mixed awe with deep, military-grade satisfaction. She didn't say a single word, but she didn't have to. We both knew the final gear of the trap had just been set in motion. The afternoon heat kept intensifying, crushing the neighborhood under a blanket of heavy, stagnant air. The asphalt on the street looked like it was melting, blurring the outlines of the trees in the distance. Inside my house, the temperature had to be rising at an alarming rate. It was a solid build, designed to trap heat in the winter, which turned it into an unforgiving oven during the summers, without the help of the central AC that Rachel kept blasting at all hours. While we waited in the cool silence of Agnes's kitchen, my mind drifted backward, pulled by the mention of pipes and shut-off valves. I remembered a Sunday afternoon almost 30 years ago. Mark was a scrawny kid who barely reached my waist. Anthony had decided to swap out the old lead pipe in the front yard for a new PVC one, worried about the quality of the water we were drinking. He had spent the entire weekend digging a deep trench in the hard dirt, his hands covered in blisters, his shirt soaked in sweat. I had asked Mark to go out to the yard to hold the flashlight for his father as the sun started to set, but Mark had refused, throwing a tantrum in the living room, complaining that the dirt would ruin his new sneakers and that he would miss his favorite TV show. Anthony, with that endless patience that eventually cost him his life, told me to leave the boy alone, that he could finish in the dark by himself. And he did.
He built the foundation of that house while his son watched television. That was Mark's tragedy. That was his fundamental flaw, the structural crack in his character that had led him to commit the sheer stupidity of changing the locks this morning. Mark had always believed that things simply appeared.
That water flowed from the tap by magic. That electricity lit the bulbs by divine right. That hot food materialized on the dining room table simply because he deserved it. He never understood the sweat, the blood, the effort, and the paperwork that upheld the illusion of his comfort. By swapping out the brass cylinder on the front door, he thought he was taking control of a kingdom. He didn't realize he was just claiming an empty box, a useless shell, because the true power over that land and everything that fed it was etched onto a notarized document sitting safely in a bank deposit box. In my name, and only my name. His arrogance had blinded him to the most basic reality of the adult world. You cannot claim ownership of what you haven't built or legally paid for. The rugged growl of a diesel engine pulled me from my thoughts. Agnes and I stepped up to the kitchen window at the same time. A large, heavy white utility truck, with the blue logo of Northern Water Utilities painted on the side doors, turned the corner and rolled slowly down the street. The tires crunched over the hot asphalt as it stopped dead center in front of my driveway, partially blocking the view of the front yard. A man stepped out of the driver's side. He was a burly worker, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark blue uniform, steel-toed work boots, and an orange reflective vest that glared under the relentless sun. He wore a cap with a frayed brim and held a thick clipboard in one hand, while lugging a heavy metal toolbox with the other. He walked with purpose toward the curb in front of my property, right to where the small iron grate protected the water meter and the main shutoff valve. The technician, whose name tag read Omar, dropped to his knees on the scalding concrete. He wedged a metal pry bar into the slots of the cover and, with a grunt of effort, lifted it, tossing it aside with a dull clang that echoed down the quiet street. He reached his gloved hands into the dark hole and began manipulating the main valve. Not even 30 seconds passed before the front door of my house was yanked open violently. Mark shot out onto the porch, nearly tripping over the 3 black trash bags holding my belongings. He looked deplorable. The light blue shirt that had looked immaculate hours before was now plastered to his torso with sweat, massive dark stains spreading across his chest and back. His face was congested, flushed red from the suffocating heat inside the house and the pure desperation eating him alive. He took the steps 2 at a time, ignoring the thirsty rose bushes, and sprinted toward the curb. "Hey, you! What the hell are you doing?" Mark yelled, waving his arms erratically as he closed in on the technician. Omar didn't flinch right away. He finished cranking the heavy brass valve with a massive crescent wrench, permanently cutting the water flow to the property before looking up at my son. He stood up slowly, wiping the grease from his gloves onto a rag hanging from his belt. His posture was relaxed but firm, the stance of a man used to dealing with angry customers every day. "Good afternoon, sir. Routine work," Omar replied in a deep, monotone voice that carried clearly all the way to Agnes's window. "I have a direct order from dispatch to execute a hard, permanent shutoff at this address. The account holder requested the cancellation of service a few minutes ago." No, that's a mistake," Mark exclaimed, stepping dangerously close to the worker. Little flecks of spit flew from his mouth. "I am the owner of this house. I live here. My mother is an old woman who lost her mind and is making prank calls to mess with me. Open that valve immediately. I've got my wife inside dying of heat, and the faucets just spit out mud. My work order specifically states that Mrs. Lucille Villalobos, the exclusive account holder, requested the shutoff. If you claim to be the legal owner of the property, I need you to show me the original property deed in your name, right this second along with your ID, to halt the procedure. If you have them, I verify them, and I leave the water on. If you don't, I have a job to do." Mark froze at the edge of the curb. His hands, which moments before had been flailing in the air with righteous indignation, dropped heavily to his sides. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his dry throat. He looked back at the house, then at the utility truck, desperately searching for an out, an excuse, a lifeline to pull him from the tidal wave of reality that was drowning him. "No, I don't have the papers here right now," he stammered, losing every ounce of the fake authority he had tried to project. They're locked away, but I swear to you this is my house. I'll give you $50 right now if you leave the valve open and pretend you were never here." The expression of bureaucratic neutrality on Omar's face vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, professional steeliness. "Keep your money, boss, before I call the cops for attempting to bribe a public utility worker," Omar warned, stepping forward and using his sheer size to intimidate Mark, who instinctively backed away. "I don't care if you have all the money in the world. No papers, no water, end of story." Without giving my son a chance to respond, Omar crouched back down over the grate, reached into his toolbox, and pulled out a solid cast-iron padlock, thick as a man's fist, attached to a braided steel cable. He threaded it through the holes of the brass valve, ensuring it would be physically impossible to turn it without destroying the entire pipe. The metallic clack of the padlock snapping shut with a dry, final click echoed in the hot afternoon air. Then he took a bright red plastic tamper seal with a printed serial number and cinched it tight around the mechanism. He pulled a small electronic tablet from his vest pocket, snapped 2 photos of the finished job, and stood up, brushing the dirt off his knees. "The meter is locked and sealed," Omar announced, staring dead at Mark, who was eyeing the heavy iron padlock like it was an alien artifact. "Let me remind you that attempting to break that lock, cut it with a saw, or tamper with the seal is a federal offense. If we detect vandalism on the infrastructure, the company will press criminal charges against the residents of the property. If you want water, go down to the main office tomorrow morning with the deed in your name and apply for a new contract. Have a good afternoon." Omar grabbed his toolbox, turned his back on my son, climbed into the white truck, and fired up the engine. The vehicle rolled down the street, leaving behind a cloud of dust that settled slowly over the thirsty rose bushes. Mark was left standing alone on the curb, his shoulders slumped, defeated by the crushing weight of his own ignorance. There was no more yelling, no more threats, no more cruel laughter from a second-floor window. There was only a grown man realizing with paralyzing terror that he had built his so-called independence on a sandcastle, and the tide had just come in. He bent down, grabbed the bars of the small iron grate, and slammed it down over the hole with sheer fury, producing a crash that made dogs bark in the distance. At that exact moment, the front door swung open again. This time it was Rachel stepping out onto the porch. If Mark looked bad, my daughter-in-law looked like she had just crossed a desert. She was wearing a silk blouse that used to be pristine white, but was now stained with sweat and plastered to her skin. Her dark hair, which she always kept perfectly straightened, was a tangled mess clinging to her damp forehead. She had a streak of dried soap on one side of her neck, and her eye makeup was smeared, giving her an unhinged look. The heat inside the house, stripped of all ventilation, and with the windows hermetically sealed, had expelled her into the outdoors in search of breathable air. "Mark!" Rachel shrieked, her voice pitching into near hysteria. She stumbled down the steps, dodging the garbage bags. "What is going on?" "I was trying to wash my face in the guest bathroom, and the faucet started spitting air and rusty mud. The toilet won't flush. There is not a single drop of water in the entire house." "Tell me you fixed the electricity. The fridge is defrosting and Nick's milk is going to rot. They put an iron padlock on the valve. We can't open it." Rachel stopped dead in her tracks in the middle of the lawn, blinking in confusion. "What do you mean they put a padlock on it?" "Call a plumber. Smash it with a hammer. Do something, for God's sake. We can't be in here without water and AC and 100-degree heat. The only way they'll turn the utilities back on is if we go to the main office with the deed to the house in my name." Rachel stared at her husband. The man who had assured her that very morning that changing the front door lock was all it took to seize the property and rid themselves of the annoying old woman demanding respect. "But you don't have the deed, Mark," Rachel screamed, shedding any last ounce of dignity. "You told me you had everything under control. You swore to me your mother couldn't do anything, that she was just an ignorant old lady who didn't understand the law. What good is having the key to a house if we can't turn on a light, flush a toilet, or take a shower?" Her eyes swept across the yard and locked onto the low hedge dividing our property from Agnes's. Through the open window of the neighbor's kitchen, she saw us clearly. Blinded by rage and heat, Rachel stomped over to the property line, trampling the daisy beds I had watered so carefully the night before. She grabbed the chain link fence, hidden behind the green leaves, shaking it violently. "Lucille!" she screeched, her face contorted. "Come out of there, you old witch! I know you can hear me. Call that company right now and tell them to take that damn padlock off. We have a small child. Nick is going to get home from school in a few hours, and he's going to die of heat stroke in this house." "Is that what you want? To kill your own grandson?" "Nick gets out of school at 4 p.m. Rachel," I said with a glacial calm that seemed to infuriate her even more. The pitch of my voice was low, but it sliced through the hot air like a scalpel. "That's 3 hours away. More than enough time for two successful, independent adults who own their own space to find a nice hotel with air conditioning and a pool. After all, you two were the ones who changed the locks this morning and told me to go find lodging. I suppose now you'll have to take your own advice." "This is our house!" Rachel screamed, pounding the fence with a closed fist, scratching her knuckles on the branches. "You have no right to do this to us. You just changed a cheap piece of metal on a wooden door. But the walls, the roof, the wires that bring the power, and the pipes that bring the water, all of that belongs to me. You acted on something that was never yours. You played at being owners with my dead husband's money and sweat. And now you're going to have to learn how to live in the desert you created yourselves." Mark ran up beside his wife, grabbing her arm to try and pull her away from the fence. He looked me in the eye, and for a fraction of a second, I saw the scared little boy who used to hide behind my skirts during thunderstorms. But the tenderness that used to answer that look was dead and buried. "Mom, please," Mark begged, his voice hoarse. "We can't stay in there. The house is an oven. The food is going to spoil. We have nowhere to go. Please, fix this." "I didn't break anything, Mark. Therefore, I have nothing to fix," I replied, turning my back to them in silence. "Enjoy your privacy." I stepped back into Agnes's kitchen and shut the screen door behind me. Through the mesh, I watched Mark and Rachel stand in the yard for a few more minutes, arguing in desperate whispers before being forced back inside the house to escape the brutal sun baking their skin. The sound of the front door closing behind them sounded like the lid of a coffin sealing shut. Agnes was watching me from the table with a crooked smile of pure admiration. "They're not going to last 2 hours in there, Lucille," my neighbor said, taking a sip of her iced tea. "In this heat, with no water or fans, they'll cook in their own juices. They'll have to run out of there with the boy as soon as they pick him up from school. And when they leave for the hotel, they're going to lock that door with the new key they bought." I walked over to the table and sat across from her. I looked at my own glass, watching the ice slowly melt into cold water. Agnes was right. Mark's sheer stupidity in changing the lock had trapped them in an uninhabitable property. But it also meant that once they abandoned the sinking ship, I would still be physically locked out of my own home. My belongings, my 40 years of memories, were still packed in 3 humiliating black trash bags on the porch, rotting in the sun as if my entire life were just refuse they could toss aside. They had made the fatal mistake of acting on what they didn't control, and the consequences of that error were already suffocating them. The trap had snapped shut on them under its own weight. Now, all that was left was the killing blow. All that was left was to reclaim what was mine and expose the sheer magnitude of their failure in front of everyone who mattered. I looked up at my old friend. The sentinel inside me was ready to take back her castle, but this time, the door wasn't going to be opened with patience or forgiveness. "Agnes," I said, my voice steady, feeling the exhaustion of my 71 years vanish completely. "Do you still have the phone number for your nephew, the one with the locksmith shop downtown?" Agnes widened her smile, a dangerous glint lighting up her dark eyes. She nodded slowly, pushing back from the table to fetch the little address book she kept in the silverware drawer. "Oh, you bet I do," Agnes replied, pulling out the book and tossing me a pen. "Do you want him to come over and quietly pop the lock after they make a run for the hotel?" "No," I said, looking at the clock on the wall. "Because tonight, when the sun goes down, that lock is getting changed again, and I want to make sure everyone hears it." Agnes didn't need me to tell her twice. With an agility that defied her 75 years, she picked up the receiver of her wall-mounted landline, that cream-colored phone she'd kept since the 80s, and dialed her nephew's number. I sat at the oilcloth table, listening to the rhythmic tick-tock of the grandfather clock, feeling the adrenaline that had kept me on my feet for the last few hours slowly shift into a cold, heavy, calculated patience. The sentinel I had become was in no rush. I had waited 5 years to get my space back. I could wait a couple more hours to watch my son's house of cards collapse under its own weight. Danny, hey sweetie. Yeah, it's Aunt Agnes, my neighbor said, resting a hand on the counter. Her tone was casual, but her eyes burned with a fierce intensity. I need a massive favor. One of your special jobs. Yeah, right next door, at Miss Lucille's house. They pulled a dirty trick on her and swapped the cylinder on her front door. I need you to come over, blow that lock wide open, and install the best hardware you've got in the shop. The heaviest, most secure deadbolt. Bring the industrial drill. Yeah, that one. The one that makes an ungodly racket. 5 o'clock? Sounds perfect. We'll be waiting with cold lemonade. Agnes hung up the phone and shot me a smile that was half comfort, half promise of war. She poured me a little more iced tea and sat across from me. We didn't talk much for the next hour. There was no need. We both kept our eyes glued to the kitchen window, which gave us a perfect panoramic view of the side of my house and the front facade. The afternoon dragged on with a suffocating slowness, dragging with it the worst heat wave the city had seen in years. From our privileged, cool vantage point, we could watch the sun ruthlessly punish the brick structure of my home. The heat was so intense that the air above the asphalt on the street seemed to ripple, distorting the shapes of the trees and the parked cars. My house, built by Anthony with thick walls and heavy insulation to withstand harsh winters, was rapidly turning into a convection oven. With the AC dead and all the windows hermetically sealed by Rachel's orders to maintain her precious privacy, the heat was piling up inside with no way out. I knew that house better than the back of my hand. I knew exactly what was happening in there, room by room, minute by minute. Mark's mistake hadn't just been a lack of respect or a spoiled brat's tantrum. It had been a monumental miscalculation. By changing the lock on a property he didn't legally own, he had acted on an illusion. He thought he was the master of the domain because he had a new key in his pocket, entirely oblivious to the fact that a house isn't just wood and bricks. A house is a living organism that needs electricity to breathe and water to flush its veins. By trying to strip me of my authority, he had personally severed the vital lifelines of his own shelter. His stupidity had lit the fuse, and now all he could do was sit there and sweat while the bomb went off. Around 3 p.m., the first signs of internal collapse began to show. We heard a muffled thud from the second floor, followed by the sound of a window violently sliding open. It was the master bedroom window, the same one Mark had yelled from hours earlier. Rachel's head poked through the opening. She was desperate, hunting for a breeze that didn't exist. The outside air, heavy and thick with humidity, rolled into the room, but it brought no relief, only more heat. Across the distance, I could hear her high-pitched voice screaming in an argument with Mark. The exact words were lost in the thick air, but the tone was unmistakable. It was the sound of panic. Without water, the toilets in the house could no longer flush. In the extreme heat, the stench of dry pipes would start creeping up the drains. Without electricity, the massive double-door fridge Rachel had bought on credit was rapidly defrosting. The meat, the milk, the vegetables, everything I had tended to with such care was now rotting in the dark. The modern, private sanctuary they had craved so badly had morphed into a toxic prison in record time. The neighborhood, which usually took a nap at that hour, began to wake up, drawn by the unusual activity and the unnatural silence of dead motors. Mr. Peter, a retiree who lived across the street, stepped out onto his porch with a hose to water his potted plants. He stood at the edge of his lawn, staring intently at the front of my house. He knew, just like every neighbor who had lived on that street for decades, that the Villalobos' air conditioning never shut off in the summer. Miss Celine, 2 houses down, came out with her broom under the guise of sweeping the sidewalk, but her eyes never left the open window where Rachel was still screaming. The community, the exact same people who had watched me sweep, paint, and tend that yard for 40 years, was silently gathering to witness the fall. At exactly 4 p.m., the signature screech of a school bus's air brakes shattered the monotony of the heat. The yellow transport stopped in front of my house. The folding doors hissed open, and Nick, my 7-year-old grandson, stepped down with his little blue backpack over his shoulders. The boy walked slowly, dragging his feet, exhausted from the school day and the sweltering afternoon. Before Nick could even reach the paved walkway, the front door of my house flew open with a violence that rattled the frame. Mark and Rachel burst outside as if they were fleeing a burning building. The sight of them was pathetic, a public fall from grace unfolding in broad daylight. Mark's shirt was completely soaked, plastered to his body, his face twisted in frustration and defeat. Rachel, for her part, looked like she had lost her mind. She was dragging 2 massive rolling suitcases across the wooden porch floor, clumsily shoving aside the black trash bags containing my belongings, the ones they had packed for me that morning. The blast of hot outside air seemed to hit Nick physically. He stopped dead in his tracks on the grass, looking at his parents in total confusion. "Mom, it's too hot. I want cold water," the boy whined, rubbing his sweaty eyes. "There is no water, Nick. There is nothing in this house." Rachel screamed at him with an aggression that made me clench my fists under Agnes's table. She dropped the suitcases, which hit the concrete with a heavy thud, and rushed at the boy, grabbing him roughly by the arm. "We are going to a hotel right now. Unlock the car, Mark. Unlock the damn car before I pass out." The spectacle of the new landlords fleeing their own domain in terror was the absolute confirmation of their failure. "I told you to fix it!" Rachel shrieked as she shoved the boy into the back seat of the car parked on the street. "You promised me that if we changed the lock, that old woman would go to a nursing home and we'd finally have peace. Look at us, Mark. Look at us." "The house smells like rot, the food is ruined, and I haven't been able to take a shower all day. You are useless." They had planned a clean, swift coup, but their own ignorance of how the real world functioned had cornered them. From the window, I watched Mark slam the trunk shut. Then he turned back toward the house. He walked back up the paved path, dodging the rose bushes his father had planted, and climbed the porch steps. He stopped in front of the solid wood front door. It was in that exact moment that my son made his final and greatest mistake, the ultimate act in a chain of stupidity that would seal his fate irreversibly. Mark reached into the pocket of his damp slacks and pulled out the new key, that shiny, gleaming little key that went with the silver cylinder he had installed that very morning. He slid it into the lock, twisted his wrist hard, and listened to the metallic click of the deadbolt securing the door. He locked it. In his small, arrogant mind, he thought that by doing so, he was protecting his territory. He believed that even if he was forced to temporarily flee to a hotel to escape the suffocating heat, the house was still his because he controlled the physical access. What he didn't understand, blinded by panic and wounded pride, was that by abandoning the property and locking that door, he was leaving the space completely defenseless. His first mistake had forced him to evacuate, and now his second mistake was handing the keys to the castle, metaphorically speaking, directly into my hands. He had just exiled himself. Mark shoved the key in his pocket, shot one last defiant glare toward Agnes's house, assuming I was hiding in there crying, and sprinted for the car. He cranked the engine with a heavy rev, the tires screeching against the hot asphalt as the vehicle sped off, vanishing around the corner. Silence fell over the street once more. The dust kicked up by the tires settled slowly over the dry leaves. The house was left empty, mute, baking in the sun. On the porch, the 3 black trash bags sat completely untouched. Agnes let out a long sigh beside me, resting her hands on the table. "They're gone," my neighbor muttered, a deeply satisfied smile wrinkling the corners of her eyes. "Fled with their tails tucked between their legs, exactly like the cowards they are." "Yes," I replied, standing up slowly. I felt the stiffness in my knees vanish entirely, replaced by an ancient, iron-willed strength. "But they left the door locked, and it's time to open it." We didn't have to wait much longer. It was 10 minutes to 5 when an old, dented work van pulled up exactly where Mark's car had been parked. On the side, hand-painted letters read, "Iron and Anvil Locksmith, 24-hour service." Danny stepped out of the van. He was a massive guy, broad-shouldered, tattooed arms, and a thick, graying beard, wearing a gray work shirt stained with grease. Agnes walked out to the back porch to greet him, and I followed her across the lawn to the property line. "Hey, Auntie," Danny grumbled in a gravelly voice, kissing Agnes on the cheek before turning to me and respectfully taking off his cap. Good afternoon, Miss Lucille. My aunt gave me the rundown. Said we've got a problem with a new cylinder on your front door. That's right, Danny. I nodded, pointing at the house. My son decided to change the lock this morning without my permission. I need to get into my house, and I need you to make sure that shiny new key he took with him never works again. Danny nodded, his face shifting into a purely professional stare. He walked to the back of his van and threw open the metal doors. He didn't pull out delicate lockpicks or thin tension wrenches. He hauled out a heavy tool bag, a claw hammer, a steel chisel, and an industrial power drill with a thick extension cord. We walked across the front lawn together, Agnes on my right, Danny taking the lead. The neighbors, who hadn't moved an inch from their observation posts, tracked us with their eyes. Mr. Peter leaned on the low fence dividing our yards, and Miss Celine took a step forward on the sidewalk. Nobody said a word, but they all knew exactly what was about to go down. They were my silent witnesses, the public jury validating my claim. We climbed the concrete steps. The 3 trash bags greeted me like a physical reminder of my son's cruelty, but I ignored them, stepping right over them. Danny knelt in front of the door, dropping his open tool bag onto the wood. He examined the silver cylinder gleaming in the sun. "This is cheap garbage, Miss Lucille," Danny said, spitting on the ground in disgust. "Cheap metal. Bought it at some chain hardware store for $20. Whoever put this in knows absolutely nothing about security. Probably thought the shine scares off thieves." "Destroy it," I ordered, my voice dead flat. Danny hooked the extension cord up to a portable generator he had brought in the van, since he knew there was no power in the house. He hoisted the heavy drill, slotted in a titanium bit designed to chew through solid steel, and pressed it dead center into the lock's keyhole. He pulled the trigger. The noise was deafening. A violent, high-pitched screech ripped through the silence of the hot afternoon. The sound of metal being ruthlessly shredded echoed off the siding of the neighboring houses. Silver shavings started flying through the air, raining down on Danny's work boots. The smell of burning oil and metal friction filled the porch. It was an ugly, brutal sound, but to my ears, it was the symphony of justice. It was the sound of Mark's illusion being ground into dust. The physical destruction of the only mechanism of control he thought he possessed. It took barely 40 seconds. With one final shove, the drill bit punched straight through the core of the cheap lock. Danny killed the drill, grabbed his steel chisel, wedged it into the mangled hole, and gave it one solid crack with the hammer. The entire cylinder gave way, breaking loose from the wood and hitting the porch floor with a pathetic clatter. Danny pushed the handle, and the heavy wooden door creaked, swinging wide open. A wave of stagnant heat, thick and carrying the faint stench of humidity and rotting food, slapped us in the face. The house was submerged in daylight shadows, hot as the mouth of a furnace, entirely empty of life and arrogance. I took a step inside, feeling the hardwood floor under my shoes, recognizing my territory. "Done, ma'am," Danny said, wiping the sweat from his forehead. From the bottom of his bag, he pulled out a heavy cardboard box. I brought what Auntie asked for: solid core deadbolt, hardened brass, anti-pick pins, and keys that can't be copied. Cost a pretty penny, but I swear to you, they couldn't open this door with a damn tank. "Install it, I'll pay whatever it costs," I replied, opening my purse to find the emergency cash I kept tucked away. Danny worked fast, with the precision of a craftsman. He yanked out the guts of the broken mechanism, cleared the splintered wood, and slotted in the heavy, dark brass hardware. The contrast with Mark's shiny junk was absolute. This wasn't an accessory, it was an unbreakable declaration of ownership. While he screwed the strike plates in, Agnes helped me drag my 3 trash bags back into the foyer. My 40 years of life were returning to the exact place they never should have left. 10 minutes later, Danny handed me a ring of 4 heavy keys with complex grooves and jagged edges. I paid him in cash, throwing in a generous tip he tried to refuse, but which Agnes forced him to take with a stern glare. "Anything else you need, Miss Lucille? You know where to find me," Danny said, packing up his tools and heading down the steps. He fired up his van and drove off, leaving behind a silence that now felt clean, purified by action. Agnes and I stood on the porch, feeling the warm breeze of the late afternoon. The sun was finally dipping low, painting the sky in shades of orange. I held my new keys in my hand, feeling their comforting weight. Suddenly, The roar of an engine redlining shattered the calm. A car drifted around the corner and slammed on the brakes right in front of my house, jumping one tire up onto the curb. It was Mark's car. The driver's door flew open before the engine even died, and my son scrambled out. He was alone. His face, which hours ago had shown the fury of his escape, now reflected pure, absolute, unhinged panic. He sprinted toward the house, breathing heavy, frantically looking at the ground and then at the door. In his right hand, he clutched the new key, the shiny little trinket he thought was his life insurance. He took the porch steps 2 at a time, but stopped dead in his tracks on the top stair. He found himself face to face with Agnes and me, standing framed in the open doorway. His eyes dropped to the lock. He saw the massive block of hardened dark brass now guarding the entrance. He saw the silver metal shavings scattered across the wood planks, and then he saw the heavy ring of keys I was calmly holding in my right hand. My wallet, Mark stammered, his voice shaking as he took a wobbly step forward. His arrogance was completely gone, wiped out by the sheer brutality of his own incompetence. I left my wallet on the kitchen counter. In the dark, in the rush, I didn't realize all my credit cards are in there, my ID, they won't let me check into the hotel, I don't have a way to pay for the room. I just need to go inside for a second. He held up his hand, showing the useless key, as if hoping that by some magic the cheap metal would slide back into the wood. I looked at my son. I looked at this 30-something-year-old man who actually believed he could erase me from my own history by changing a lock. His mistake, his total lack of understanding of what held his world together, had taken him from the lord of the manor to a beggar at his own doorstep in under 8 hours. He had no house, no utilities, and now, thanks to his own sloppy escape, he didn't even have his identity or the money to buy a bed. The neighbors were still there. Mr. Peter with his arms crossed on his lawn, Miss Celine standing firm on the sidewalk. They were watching the man who tried to throw his mother out on the street beg for a piece of plastic so he could sleep in a bed. "This house is closed, Mark," I said. My voice was steady, ringing out across the porch and carrying clearly to everyone watching. There was no yelling, no tears, no drama, just the cold delivery of a settled fact. "You changed the rules yourself this morning. You told me to find a hotel. I guess you'll just have to find one that takes guests without ID, or sleep in the car with your family." "Mom, please," he pleaded, taking another step, his eyes welling up with tears of pure frustration. "Just let me go in for 1 minute to grab my cards. Rachel is in the car with the kid, crying from the heat in a hotel parking lot. You acted on something that didn't belong to you. You decided you could dispose of my life. Everything happening to you right now is a consequence of your own decisions. There is no wallet in there that can save you from your own stupidity." I took a step backward into the dark, sweltering house that now belonged entirely to me. I looked Mark in the eyes one last time, watching as the total, crushing realization of his defeat paralyzed him on the porch. Slowly, never breaking eye contact, I pulled the heavy wooden door shut. The new solid brass deadbolt clicked into place with a dry, heavy, final thud, leaving my son outside, exposed to the neighborhood, holding a key that no longer opened a single door in the world. The echo of the brass deadbolt reverberated through the dark foyer, traveling through the floorboards and up my ankles, marking the absolute end of a tyranny I had allowed for far too many years. I stood perfectly still in the shadows, resting my forehead against the warm wood of the front door. Outside, silence had returned to the street, broken only by the hollow sound of Mark's footsteps dragging down the paved walkway, shuffling like a man condemned to exile. I heard his engine fire up with a choked roar, the tires screeching against the asphalt as he drove away forever, from the fortress he arrogantly thought he had conquered with a cheap piece of metal. I turned around and faced the guts of my own house. The heat was a physical entity, a thick, oppressive wall that squeezed my chest and made it hard to breathe. Without the constant hum of the central AC, the silence was sepulchral, almost unnatural in such a large building. It smelled like confinement, like baked dust, and a sickly sweetness creeping out from the kitchen, where the leftovers Rachel kept in the massive double-door fridge were rapidly rotting. I walked slowly down the hallway, navigating by the faint orange light of the sunset, leaking through the tightly shut blinds. My knees protested with sharp spikes of pain, inflamed from the tension of the day, but my mind was sharper and clearer than it had ever been. I reached the kitchen. Resting on the massive black granite island Rachel had demanded we install last year, complaining that my old tiles made the house look miserable, was the object that had sealed my son's absolute defeat: Mark's dark brown leather wallet. It was splayed open, flashing the edges of his gold credit cards, a wad of cash, and the corner of his driver's license. The passport to his fake independence, abandoned in the rush of his own stupidity. I didn't touch it. I stared at it with the same clinical indifference one uses to look at a dead leaf on the lawn. It was the symbol of his arrogance, and now it was the lead anchor keeping him drowned in the misery of the street. Suddenly, 3 sharp taps on the back window snapped me out of my trance. It was Agnes. Through the glass, fogged up by the heat, I saw her holding an LED camping lantern and a small blue hard-shell cooler. I walked over to the back door, threw the manual lock, and let her in. The warm outside breeze, though heavy with summer, felt like a heavenly relief compared to the stagnant oven my kitchen had become. "He's gone for good," Agnes said, setting the cooler on the table and flicking on the lantern. The bright white light threw long, sharp shadows against the walls. I watched him from my porch. He was walking hunched over, staring at the ground like he was looking for answers in the cement. He got in the car and didn't even have the guts to look back. Mr. Peter and Miss Celine stayed on the sidewalk until the car disappeared around the corner. The whole block knows what happened, Lucille. The whole neighborhood just watched the trash take itself out. "Come to my guest room," she continued. "It has a fantastic ceiling fan. You can't stay in this oven." "No," I said softly, but with a firmness that left no room for debate. "I'm not going to wait for Mark to borrow money from some friend, rent a moving truck, and show up tomorrow afternoon playing the victim, demanding to come inside and pack his things. I am not giving them the satisfaction of walking down my hallways ever again. When the sun comes up tomorrow, there won't be a single trace of them left on this property." Agnes looked at me. She saw the icy determination that had replaced the selfless mother I used to be. She nodded slowly, making no attempt to talk me out of it. She left me the lantern, 2 extra bottles of ice water, and a sandwich wrapped in foil, promising to come back first thing in the morning. When I heard the latch of the back door click shut behind her, I was completely alone in the sweltering silence of my reclaimed castle. I finished drinking the water, tied my gray hair into a tight bun at the nape of my neck, and walked out to the garage. I clicked on Agnes's lantern. The beam of light sliced through the dark, illuminating Anthony's dusty tools and a stack of heavy-duty corrugated cardboard boxes I had saved from the last time we bought appliances. I grabbed a roll of industrial packing tape, a black marker, and started hauling the boxes up the main staircase, 3 at a time. The heat on the second floor was even more oppressive, the hot air trapped right beneath the shingled roof. I walked into the master bedroom, the sanctuary I had shared with my husband for decades, the room I had surrendered 5 years ago in a misunderstood act of love. Under the beam of the lantern, the room looked alien. Rachel had ripped down my hand-embroidered floral curtains and replaced them with sterile gray blinds. She had banished my solid oak furniture to the garage to install glass and metal shelves that looked like they belonged in a corporate office catalog. I set the lantern down on one of those cold shelves and began the purge. I slid open the massive closet doors. Rachel's clothes, meticulously color-coordinated on black velvet hangers, reeked of expensive perfume, dry cleaning, and suffocating confinement. I started pulling them down one by one. I didn't throw them in a rage. I didn't rip them. I didn't toss them on the floor. Uncontrolled anger no longer lived in my body. I folded them with the same flawless, mechanical precision I used to iron my grandson's school uniforms, stacking silk blouses, linen pants, designer skirts, and evening gowns into the bottom of the cardboard boxes. I did the exact same thing with Mark's suits, with his light blue shirts, identical to the one he was wearing when he yelled at me from the window, with his ties and his polished shoes. The physical effort was titanic. My hands, warped by arthritis, cracked with every movement. Sweat soaked my cotton dress, sliding down my back and stinging my eyes. The pain in my lower back turned into a constant, hot stabbing sensation that forced me to stop every 15 minutes to stretch and take a sip of the ice water Agnes had left me. But the adrenaline, pure and crystalline, kept me going. Every folded shirt was a grievance erased. Every packed pair of shoes was a silenced insult. Every box sealed with duct tape was a boundary restored that they would never cross again. I moved to the dresser. I emptied the drawers full of Rachel's cosmetics, her imported creams, her costume jewelry, and Mark's paperwork. I left absolutely nothing. I packed Nick's toys into a separate box, feeling a pang of sadness as I touched his little plastic cars, but instantly remembering that unconditional love did not mean letting his parents trample me right in front of him. By 4 a.m., the master bedroom was entirely empty, stripped of every trace of their parasitic occupation. Nothing was left but bare walls and silence. I grabbed the boxes, which weighed like lead, and began the most dangerous task, dragging them down the hallway and carefully sliding them down the wooden stairs to the ground floor. My arms were shaking from extreme exhaustion, and I had to sit on the bottom step for half an hour, breathing heavily in the dark, waiting for my heart to stop hammering so violently against my ribs. At 7 a.m., as the first rays of a pale, menacing sun began to filter through the cracks of the blinds, my foyer looked like a logistics warehouse. 18 cardboard boxes, perfectly sealed and labeled, formed an impenetrable wall right in front of the armored front door. Resting on top of them was Mark's wallet, placed on the highest box like the cherry on top of a very bitter cake. At exactly 8 a.m., the unmistakable rumble of a heavy, asthmatic diesel engine broke the neighborhood's morning calm. I peeked through the living room window, parting the blinds just a fraction. An old, rusted moving truck with peeling paint parked in front of my gate, in the exact spot where the water company's truck had stopped the day before. Mark climbed out of the passenger side. He didn't come with Rachel. He came with a young guy in paint-stained work clothes, who I vaguely recognized as Javier, one of the mechanics from the dealership where my son worked. Mark was a mere shadow of the arrogant, cruel man who had sneered out the window 24 hours earlier. He was wearing the exact same wrinkled, sweat-stained clothes from the day before. His eyes were bloodshot, his hair was a mess, and deep, dark bags hung under his eyes, betraying a night of absolute insomnia, probably spent in the reclining seat of his car or on the hard sofa of some distant relative. He walked dragging his feet, hunched under the invisible weight of his own stupidity. He opened the small iron gate and walked up the paved path. He climbed the porch steps and stopped in front of the door. He raised his right hand and with trembling knuckles gave 2 soft, pathetic knocks against the solid wood. I turned the heavy brass deadbolt. The metallic click sounded like a gunshot in the quiet morning. I opened the door only halfway, blocking the frame with my own body, holding a rigid posture that hid the fact that my knees were shaking from pulling an all-nighter. The stagnant heat of the house collided with the cool morning breeze. Mark looked up. His lips trembled, searching for words that were entirely useless now. Before he could articulate a single syllable of a hollow apology, I raised my left hand and handed him his precious leather wallet. He took it with clumsy fingers, staring at it like it was an alien object. Then, his eyes drifted into the foyer, discovering the wall of 18 perfectly stacked cardboard boxes. The sheer magnitude of my night's work seemed to hit him physically. He realized, in that exact second, that there would be no negotiation, no tears, no yelling, no forced reconciliation. The eviction was total, final, and irreversible. "Your things are ready, Mark," I said, my voice so flat and devoid of emotion that it seemed to scare him more than if I had screamed. "Take them right now. I don't want this truck blocking my street any longer." Agnes, of course, was standing on her side porch with her arms crossed and a military smirk carved into her face. Mark felt the weight of those eyes burning into the back of his neck. The public humiliation, the raw exposure of his failure in front of the people he considered beneath him, broke him entirely. He gave a weak signal to Javier, and the two of them began the grueling, humiliating task of hauling the heavy boxes from my foyer out to the back of the truck. It was 2 hours of a silent, pathetic parade. 2 hours where my son had to walk back and forth under the rising sun, carrying the weight of the material life his wife had hoarded, fully exposed to the relentless scrutiny of the community. I never moved from the doorway. I stood there like a pillar of salt, making sure they didn't scuff the walls, didn't scratch the hardwood floors, making sure their retreat was as clean as it was final. When Javier loaded the last box and slammed the metal doors of the truck shut, Mark stood at the bottom of the porch steps. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of a trembling hand. He looked at the rose bushes his father had planted. Then he looked up at me. His eyes were welling with tears of frustration and defeat. "Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking, taking a wobbly step toward the first stair. "Please. Rachel is having a breakdown at her sister's apartment. The three of us don't fit in that miserable place. I don't have the money for a new security deposit right now. Don't do this to me. I'm your son. He only knows how to consume. You don't have any of that. Now leave, and don't ever step foot on my sidewalk again." I had my canvas purse with me, but this time it wasn't full of grocery receipts. Inside rested the thick brown cardboard folder Anthony had given me the night of the storm. My first stop was the main office of Northern Water Utilities. The air conditioning in the massive customer service lobby dried my sweat instantly. I pulled a ticket and waited. When my number was called, I presented my ID and the original, stamped, notarized deeds, proving that Lucille Villalobos was the sole and absolute owner of the property. The clerk checked the watermark, punched the data into the system, and with a polite smile, issued the reconnection order. "We'll dispatch a technician immediately to remove the physical padlock, Mrs. Villalobos," the young man assured me. From there, I walked 2 blocks to the imposing glass building of Southern Energy and Utilities. The process was even faster. The operator scanned my deeds, verified my identity, and hit a few keys on her computer. "Service has been restored remotely, ma'am. The power is already back on at your residence," she informed me, handing back my precious papers. I got back to my house just past noon. When I unlocked the front door with my heavy new key, I was greeted by a glorious symphony. The deep, steady hum of the central air conditioning flooded the hallway, pushing out blasts of ice-cold air that instantly swept away the stagnant heat of the night before. The massive fridge in the kitchen was roaring, kicking its cooling cycle into overdrive. I walked out to the front yard just in time to see Omar, the same burly technician in the orange vest, kneeling by the grate at the curb. He tipped his hat to me respectfully as he snipped the red tamper seal and removed the heavy iron padlock. He cranked the brass valve, and I heard the distinct hiss of pressurized water rushing back through the underground pipes toward the heart of my home. I walked inside and turned on the kitchen faucet. The water sputtered, spitting out trapped air and a bit of reddish sediment for a few seconds before flowing crystal clear, freezing cold, and abundant. I washed my face and hands, feeling like I was scrubbing off years of invisible humiliation. But victory required cleaning. I spent the rest of the afternoon purging the house of the infection. I hauled out massive black trash bags, ruthlessly tossing the rotting meat, the sour milk, the wilted vegetables, and the expensive dressings Rachel had abandoned in the defrosted fridge. I scrubbed the glass shelves with bleach and hot water until the sickly smell vanished entirely, replaced by the sterile, clean scent of chlorine. I opened every window for an hour to let the cool evening breeze circulate, sweeping out the very last shadows of the invasion. It's been 3 months since that scorching summer Tuesday. Autumn has arrived in the city, bringing crisp breezes that make the dry leaves crunch on the sidewalks. The house is mine again, body and soul. My old Singer sewing machine is back in its rightful place, right in front of the big bay window in the master bedroom, where I can watch the street while I work. Rachel's gray blinds ended up in the dumpster, replaced by my embroidered floral curtains that flutter softly in the wind. The news from the outside world gets to me through Agnes, who has an enviable network of informants across the entire district. Mark and Rachel ended up cramped in her sister's tiny apartment. Word is, the screaming matches can be heard through the paper-thin walls of the building. My son's arrogance shattered completely when he was forced to work double shifts at the dealership and weekends at a local mechanic shop just to try and pay down their mounting debt and save up for a rental deposit that seems entirely out of reach. The house of cards collapsed on their heads, crushing their marriage under the weight of the financial reality they always ignored. Nick, my grandson, comes to visit me every Sunday afternoon. Mark is the one who drops him off. He parks his car at the corner, several yards away from my property line. He opens the door to let the boy out, and he stands there next to his vehicle, his eyes glued to the asphalt, never daring to cross the imaginary line of my sidewalk. He never looks up at the house. His punishment isn't just living in the misery he brought upon himself. His true punishment is knowing that paradise was right at his fingertips, and he changed the lock to keep himself out. I step out onto the porch to greet my grandson with open arms. Today, I prep the dough for the beef turnovers, kneading the flour and shortening on the black granite counter that I now enjoy in absolute solitude. The boy runs toward me, his mouth already watering in anticipation, and I wrap him in a hug, engulfing him in the scent of home-cooked food and clean laundry. As the sun begins to set, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, Agnes walks through the little wooden gate in the side fence. She brings a fresh pot of coffee. We sit together on the rustic bench under the protective shade of the rose bushes Anthony planted, the ones I now water religiously every morning, which have bloomed with astonishing vitality. I look at the front of my house, the solid brick walls, the windows glowing with warm light from inside, the immaculate lawn. I slip my right hand into the pocket of my cotton apron, and my fingers brush the cold, heavy metal of my new brass key. I don't need to pull it out to know it's there, anchoring me to the earth that belongs to me by right, by sweat, and by law. I take a sip of coffee, listening to the sound of my grandson's laughter as he plays in the living room, and I smile into the perfect silence of a house that finally breathes in peace.